Hi, visual storytellers, me again, back with the P of carp, and that is proximity. Proximity uses the brain's tendency to seek patterns. This tendency is part of a visual theory called Gestalt. Gestalt visual theory has a bunch of elements that I'm going to talk about in a future lecture. But what you need to know today is that one of the principles of Gestalt that relates to design is the fact that when we see elements that are placed together on a page, we perceive them as a unit. This is a very important principle of design. When you place related information closely together, it forms a visual unit. Proximity creates relationships between elements on a page, just as alignment and repetition and contrast also create relationships. You want to create relationships between elements on a page because that way when a viewer looks at those elements, they know intuitively what goes together. Good design is intuitive. It enables a viewer to understand something without thinking too much about it. Here's a very simple example of proximity. We have dots here, circles, black circles. If these were spread out, we would see no relationship between them. But because dots are placed together, we don't see or notice first the individual circles. What we notice is a square, a line, and a triangle. You are using proximity all the time without realizing it when you take notes in a class. Now, I have typed this up, so your handwriting doesn't look this good, probably. Maybe it does. Mine certainly does not. I've taken some random, unrelated terms and I've organized them into a list. I have a heading. Then I have related elements under that heading. I've created hierarchy by using bullets. I've actually created more proximity by using repeating red to group these elements together. But here's what's key in proximity, and that is white space. The white space, the extra line space I've added between each unit on this list groups these units. Now, when you're taking notes and you're handwriting, what you're doing without thinking about it is skipping a line on the page. Same thing happens when you're making an outline for something, right? You're making an outline for a presentation. You put space between each unit of your presentation. And by doing this, you're creating proximity so that when you have to read that out loud, it enables you to see intuitively what goes together. This resume example I showed you in an earlier lecture on contrast. This resume right here has good alignment. I've got hierarchy by indenting. I've aligned all of these elements left. But look what happens when I take the space out between the headings and the related text. Now I've also added boldface, which makes these units easier to see. That's the benefit of contrast. But by taking out this space and adding space here, I visually create a unit here. So look at that again. We've got that, and we've got that. Key to this, white space. Now, sometimes you're using a lot of white space, as in here, I've got a bunch of white space here, but the way I'm using white space groups each one of these sections into separate units. This white space creates a unit. White space is an element like type in art, and it's used to separate groups. So when you're designing your infographic, and I talked about how you want to create little units within your infographic in which you put information. When you do that, you need to think about what separation do I need to put between each unit of thing on my infographic so those things in that unit are grouped. Mistakes that novice designers make: arranging elements so they look good, or essentially filling all the space rather than forming logical relationships. Part of this has to do with the sizing of things. So often I see when students create infographics, they make their type and their elements too big, so they're crammed together on the page. And what you want to do is you want to make things smaller and put space between those units. Don't space everything evenly. Don't make that mistake. You would think a business card would be the easiest thing to design because it's small, right? And yet, what happens when people are making this little business card is they space everything out. They center and they space. Do we see any kind of visual relationship between what's important here? No, we don't. But you look at the right example, and this example, by the way, is from your textbook, which has many good examples. So you must look at your textbook so that you can understand all of the CART principles better, the non-designer's design book. Here, the designer has grouped the address with the place, and then put separation between the number and the website. Now, they could have taken this space out and put it all together, but this creates something that's more visually intuitive because it's grouping the address. This is not part of the address, so separate it. Here was a really wonderful infographic that a student in my class made last semester about note-taking and how we process information better when we write it down by hand than when we type it. What she's done is she has grouped each unit here by creating separate even units, or more or less even, for each group of information. So that's great. Intuitively, you understand that this goes together and this goes together. But one of the things that helps here is that she's drawn lines. And because this is on notebook paper, these lines work great. But if this was not on notebook paper and these lines were removed, take a second to visualize what would happen. What would happen is this information would start to run up against this information. If she were going to do this with outlines, what she would need to do is put more space, an additional space of line between this and this, this and this, and this and this. Here is another infographic created by another student from a past semester, in which he's doing some things right with proximity, but in other ways there's confusion here. And the confusion lies in this area because there's more space here than there is here. So now this all kind of runs together and it becomes very visually crammed and not intuitive. How could he solve this problem? Simply by making all of his jerseys, which he created, by the way, himself in InDesign, which was amazing. If he would have made all of this smaller so that there could be an additional space here. Now I'm going to say something else about this because relates to what you might be doing. He has 5 things here. Well, it is very difficult to design 5 units because you can't put them in columns. What could he have done? What could he have done as an alternative to this? Well, we are not limiting you to creating infographics that are 8.5 by 11. What I would do if I had 5 things is I would have made a narrower and longer infographic. So each one of these would have been on their own line. So you would see a jersey here with the title, the name of the person over it, and the information along the side. And you would have done that in a vertical, longer infographic. Because this format, while it allows him to put some information above, down here it requires him to put it to the side. And what you want to do in an infographic is create a pattern. Here's another infographic that a student created a couple of semesters ago about the history of hot chocolate. Now, we wouldn't be allowing you to do this today because this doesn't have a local angle. We're pushing you to be more journalistic. But I'm just talking about the design here and about the use of proximity. He has spaced each of these elements the same. If he had taken the space out here and put an additional line of white space there, that would have grouped this element so that visually this would be easier to process. Remember, you are trying to make whatever you design intuitive and easy to process for the viewer. This one was one that a student created last semester. And, last semester turned into a hot mess in the second half. So we allowed students to use Canva. You can still use Canva this semester, but Canva takes a lot of the design work out of it for you. But Canva templates are designed by designers and they know what they're doing. So what you see here is great proximity, right? The designer has grouped these elements and put more space between each one of these. And by doing that, creates very clear proximity in this text. Ideally, I might have had even a little more space between these so that these are more intuitively grouped together. The images and the graphics with the text. But this works. I don't have to think about this. I don't have to process this to figure it out. Proximity in resumes. I provided you with that early example, but now I'm going to provide you with another example of a student who took a resume and redesigned it, and it had much better proximity. John Merker graduated in 2015, 5 years ago, and this was the resume that he had when he came in to my class, J300. But he wanted to redo it. There were good reasons to redo it. Rarely do resumes work well across one wide column because he centered this text. Remember, I said, don't center. If you're going to align left. So we have these different awkward spaces to each side of the heading. But he's had to use lines in here to group these elements. Here was the second version. Aha! See what happens when you design in 2 columns, for one thing, and you use great proximity. Now there's a space here, right? But there's more space here. So even though there's space here, this is still visually grouped. Visually grouped, and grouped. He's also using repetition, which I'm going to talk about, by repeating the colors. That also helps move the eye intuitively through the headings. Proximity applies to all design. Websites, signs, menus. Start looking at menus now when you go into restaurants and see how they've used alignment and proximity, and see what a difference it makes when a designer has designed that resume and put space between entrees and appetizers, right? And not spaced everything evenly. Here's some websites. Psychology Today. Proximity. Contrast, first of all, by making the titles bigger. But proximity by putting extra space between each element and putting these. So these are closer together than this. That's what you want. Put the things that are related closer together and then put space between them. Vox Magazine. Online. Contrast the headings and extra space to create individual visual units. Also, I want to point out there are only, apart from the logo, there are only 2 typefaces on this page. This one and this. Oh, actually, I'm lying. There are 3. This is 1 and this is 1. But the rest is italic. The rest is sans serif. And you see a lot of sans serif used in websites because it's easier to read on a screen, typically, than serif fonts. Urban Outfitters. Designed by a designer. But look at the units. We know that this goes together, this goes together, and this goes together. We don't think that this goes with this, partly because of the 3-column layout, but by putting extra space here, it groups these elements. And this little layout from a magazine, you see the proximity? Didn't space these evenly, but put the heading with the related text. So we know, I'm going to say this like 1,000,000 times, we know this goes together. We know this goes together. Repetition, using red to move your eye down through these headings. And last but not least, my syllabus. I designed my syllabus in InDesign, by the way. I spent quite a bit of time on it, creating a grid so that it had 3 columns. But notice my proximity. I've put the heading with the related text, so visually you know this goes together. Now, granted, I have extra spaces here, but the heading does grouping the heading does the job of grouping this entire section. When I designed this, I did try taking all of these spaces out, but then it became even less easy to read and it became less intuitive and a lot more crammed. So this is what I settled on. But watch what happens when I space the headings evenly. Now, all of this starts to run together. Do you see that? Compare that with this on the right, where I've got the heading grouped with the related text. So as a wrap-up, when you place related information closely together, it forms a visual unit.